Resident Evil builds its legacy on a simple, terrifying promise: survival horror. Limited ammo, claustrophobic corridors, and the constant fear of what's lurking around the corner. Yet by the late 2000s and early 2010s, the franchise completely abandoned its roots. While Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 are technically some of Capcom's best-selling games of all time, they remain the most universally polarized and intensely disliked mainline entries among longtime fans. So, how did the undisputed king of survival horror turn to a generic Hollywood blockbuster? Let's break down exactly why the community turned on them. To understand the downfall of 5 and 6, we have to look at the game that inadvertently caused it: Resident Evil 4, released in 2005. RE4 was a masterpiece that revolutionized gaming industry. With its over-the-shoulder camera, it perfectly balanced tense horror with a satisfying action, but it also planted a dangerous seed. Capcom saw the massive mainstream success of RE4 action element and concluded that horror didn't sell, action did. When Resident Evil 5 arrived in 2009, it took RE4 engine, stripped away the remaining shadows, and threw players into blinding and Carcassonne. The primary complaint the game completely erased is isolation. By forcing a mandatory two-player co-op system, the fear factor vanished. It is impossible to feel terrified or helpless when you have a heavily armed partner backing you up. And if you didn't have a real-life friend to play with, you were stuck with the single-player companion AI. The AI was notoriously frustrating, constantly wasting your precious ammo, consuming green herbs for minor scratches, and standing completely still during boss fights. Add in linear level-based progression, a mediocre real-time inventory system, and enemies attacking you with guns and vehicles, and it feels like less Resident Evil and more like a Gears of War clone. A bad one. If Resident Evil 5 stepped over the line, Resident Evil 6 completely blew the line up with their rocket launcher. Released in 2012, Reseek attempt to appeal to literally everyone, and in doing so, pleased almost no one. Capcom split the game into four entirely separate campaigns: Leon, Chris, Jake, and Ada. They promised a massive global bioweapon thriller. Instead, player got a bloated, disjointed mess. The gameplay shifted fully into a high-mobility third-person shooter. You could now sprint, slide, dive backwards, and punch monsters into a bloody pulp with an expanded melee system. Ammo was abundant, and any lingering shred of survival horror was completely dead. The game heavily relied on intrusive quick-time events that interrupted your flow, confusing AI menus, terrible vehicle sections, and a frustrating cover system. It traded atmospheric storytelling for Michael Bay explosions and a plot so convoluted with clones and global conspiracies that it felt entirely unrecognizable. Ultimately, the community consensus on Reddit and gaming forums highlights that Re5 and Re6 are not necessarily terrible video games on their own. As action-packed coach co-op shooter plays to play with a friend, they can be an absolute blast. But as mainline Resident Evil titles, they completely lost the franchise identity. They proved that when you try to cater to everyone, you alienate your core fan base. The backlash against Rizik was so massive that it forced Capcom into a hard course correction. It directly birthed the terrifying grounded first-person soft reboot of Resident Evil 7, which successfully saved the franchise. Without the massive action-heavy failures of Resident Evil 5 and 6, we would have never gotten